in case number 9471, a continuation of our trial type evidentiary hearing. Since we adjourned last evening, do we have any new or additional parties that have not made appearances? Seeing none, do we have any preliminary matters before we hear from Transource's first witness today? Counsel for Transource, please call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. We would like to call to the witness stand David Ray Dominy.
Mr. Dominy, please enter the box and remain standing.
Sure. Mr. Dominy, will you please state your full name and address for the record, sir?
Yes, my name is David Ray Dominy. My address is 8910 Cardwell Lane, Houston, Texas.
And sir, who is your employer and what is your title?
I'm the managing director of the Houston office of the Valuation Advisory Services Group for Jones Lang LaSalle.
And today, who are you testifying on behalf of?
For Transource, Maryland.
Thank you, sir. Do you have before you a document that is entitled The Rebuttal Testimony of David Ray Dominy, dated May the 8th, 2019, consisting of 13 pages and one exhibit?
If that's a question, yes, I do have that. Yes.
Your Honor, at this time we would like to have marked for identification Mr. Dominy's rebuttal testimony as Applicant's Exhibit 20.
So marked.
Mr. Dominy, was this testimony prepared by you or under your supervision, sir?
It was.
And today, do you have any additions, corrections, or modifications to that testimony?
In reviewing for this matter, I happened to notice on page 4 of the document where I had made a reference to 10 case studies, and actually I included 7 in this report.
Okay, so on page 4, do you know what line that's on, sir? Would it happen to be line 16?
Well, I'm heading there. Yes, it's on line 16 of the report.
And that 10 should be changed to 7?
It should, yes.
Well, other than the modification or the change on page 4, are there any other additions, corrections?
No, that's it.
So, Mr. Dominy, if I were to ask you the same questions that are contained in your rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same?
They would be indeed.
And is this testimony true and correct to the best of your information, knowledge, and belief?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this time we would respectfully move that Applicant's Exhibit 20 be moved into evidence.
Seeing no objection, Applicant's Exhibit number 20 is moved into evidence.
And Your Honor, we have no live rejoinder for Mr. Dominy, so he's available at this time for cross-examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. McElmore. Would you like to begin?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Mr. Dominy, good afternoon. My name is Sandra McLemore. I represent the Power Plant Research Program in this case.
Good afternoon.
In your testimony, you state that you conducted a literature review of transmission line impacts on land prices. Is that correct?
Yes, there's been about 100 different articles that have, in the body of knowledge, that have been produced in the last 50 years regarding the impact of transmission lines on properties, and I reviewed that as part of my study here today.
And how many did you include in your testimony?
I included, I think, 16 within the study today.
And were any of those studies involved property in Maryland?
No.
Okay. How many of those involved farmland?
I think 5 of the 16 involved farmland.
And which of those studies best represents the setting in Harford County in this case?
Well, they're all unique, but the agricultural properties that are at hand would be best represented by the agricultural examples.
And where were those two? What states were they in?
of the different, well, the two case studies
Right.
is different than the articles. The case studies were actually in Illinois and in Wisconsin.
Right, and I'm going to get to the case studies. I was actually talking about just the literature search. Were there any that involved farmland in Maryland?
No.
All right. Now, getting to the case studies that you were just referring to, I think they believe they're on page 7. I apologize. I can't find the page. I know they're in here, though.
They start on page 12.
Okay. And how many case studies did you review? I think you just said 7, maybe?
I included 7 total case studies, 2 of which were devoted to agriculture.
And that's what you were just talking about. What state were those in?
One of them was in Illinois and one of them was in Wisconsin.
And are you familiar with the property values in those states as opposed to Maryland?
Well, there's actual transactional data that occurred both on and off a transmission line in those states as part of that study. So I do have that information available.
But are the property values, do you have any evidence that the property values in those states are similar to the property values in Harford County, Maryland?
No, this was to draw an analogy, and that is one property on a high voltage transmission line, one property off a high voltage transmission line, and what the relationship was.
And did that study show the property values prior to the construction of the transmission line, and then also after the construction line? After the transmission line was constructed?
Well, in one circumstance, it shows property values of a history of time, 13 years worth of property analysis that occurred after the construction of a power line. The second example includes property valuations or transactional data that occurred after a power line had been announced, the final routing had been done, and easements have been put in place across the properties over a 2-year period.
But isn't it true that there was nothing that showed prior to the construction, before anyone knew that the transmission line was coming, and then also at the same location, the property values after the transmission line was actually built? Or is there?
Well, no, there are. There is such a case study in the residential side, but on agricultural side, the lines went in different directions, and so we were able to, within these areas, get data on a couple of different lines that were in place. And then in between those, we found farm agricultural sales that had never and still haven't been had the influence of a high voltage transmission line across them.
Are residential properties and farm properties the same, agricultural properties the same? Can you evaluate them the same way?
Well, no, you don't. Typically, I would say. There's usually a residential component associated with a lot of agricultural properties, and it would be valued separately, generally.
Okay. And do you have a specific example in your case studies that's the most similar to the setting in Harford County that we're discussing in this case?
I would say the 2 properties that have the agricultural practices occurring on them probably are the 2 most relevant. Although they're not necessarily growing the same crop, they're still using the best agricultural practices for the area as they farm different things.
Did any of them have orchards on them? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did any of them have preservation property, like a MALP program, if you're familiar with that, we have here in Maryland?
I am familiar with that program in Maryland, but I don't believe any of those properties had them. Some may well have had conservation easements on them, but I'm not for sure.
In any of your literature search or your case studies, did you have any study that indicated any property valuations with regard to preservation lands?
No.
Okay. Now you state on page 8, if you look at line 15 to 18, and you state that it cannot be assumed to negatively affect nearby properties. Is your testimony that it positively does not affect property values?
My testimony is that in reviewing both case studies that were done within the literature that's been produced over the years, as well as meta-analysis of large samplings of data that we looked at, as well as the case studies that we particularly looked at here, that the information contained in my report would reveal that there is no systematic damage to property as a result of a high voltage transmission line being adjoining it, but maybe not necessarily on it. When it's on a property, it is diminished to the extent of the easement would diminish the value of the property in of itself.
But you have none of that information in your case studies, right? You didn't have any easement properties in your case studies or literature. Is that not true?
No, that's not true.
Oh, I thought you just said that. Which literature search or case study included?
Or maybe I'm confused. My understanding was about the impact of real estate values as a result of being near a power line.
Okay.
Mr.
And-
Domine, why don't we stop for a second? We'll have counsel rephrase or re-ask the question.
Okay,
Thank
thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate it. You know what? I'll just move on
Okay.
to make it even easier. Do you agree if this transmission line were put on an existing line, that the impacts to the property that would have been on the new Greenfield line could be avoided? In other words, if no transmission line went in near a property, would it not have less impacts than if a transmission line actually did go in?
Well, the studies indicate that there is a diminishment to the extent of the easement is going across the property.
But-
So if there's no easement going across the property, then therefore it would have less impact in of itself. The residual impact, which I think is what you're asking me, and maybe I'm wrong, would the data in here shows that it doesn't exist to the extent that you might think necessarily.
Right, I think you answered my question. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you finished, Ms. McElmore?
Yes, I am.
Mr. Stevens.
Good afternoon, Mr. Domine. My name is Ben Stevens. I represent the Tanners and the Scotts, who are on the pathway of the IEC East project. You would agree that aesthetic issues affect property values, correct?
They can. They don't necessarily, but they can.
And you would agree that it's important to get input from local appraisers and real estate agents in regards to property values?
No, I think it's important to get transactional data about property transactions to show how the market really feels. Many times we have a predetermined disposition that some condition that might be deemed to be detrimental might have a negative impact on the property, but until we see the actual sale transactions show how the market really reacts, we don't know.
And that's difficult because when a power line is necessarily brought in, people don't necessarily immediately sell their property, right?
Well, that's true. Most people don't sell their property just because a power line comes through.
And so these case studies, they went over a period of years?
They did.
Okay. And there's market fluctuations in the real estate market over those same periods, correct?
Of course.
Okay. And did they factor that in?
It did. We made adjustments for inflation to those transactions over that time frame.
And so I'm correct in stating that you didn't contact any local appraisers or realtors in the Harford County area to determine their position regarding the impacts of putting in high-powered power lines through properties?
No, but an appraiser by necessity would look at the guidelines that we use in appraising properties, called USPAP, and they would have to look at actual data versus a perceived perception of a damage. So, and even the articles that have been referenced in my report tell us that a lot of times you ask somebody, do you have a power line on that property, does it impact value? And somebody's out of perception says yes. And if somebody were coming across my property with one, I would probably say I don't want it either. That's not the question. The question is, how does it impact market value? and that has to be determined by transactions, which is what I've tried to represent in this information.
And there were no market or case studies that involved Maryland properties, correct?
That's true.
And you would agree that determining market value is an art much more than a science.
It certainly is an art and not a science, I agree.
And you could have two properties next door to each other, and based on the aesthetics, if both of those properties are for sale and one is aesthetically pleasing and one is aesthetically not, one's going to sell for higher and faster than the other one, correct?
If I take on your assumption that whatever the element is actually a detriment, then I would have to agree with you. That's a possibility.
And in regards to your testimony on page 8, line 17, your conclusion is that there is diminution, but you believe it to be slight and sometimes dissipates completely.
No, that's what there's 3 articles here that looked at the metadata, like large analysis of data, and their conclusion was when diminution is present, it tends to be slight and sometimes diminishes or dissipates completely over time.
Would you say having a high-powered transmission line outside of 3 sides of your house would be more significant than having a high-powered transmission line going through, hundreds of yards away from your house?
Well, every property is unique, and so I would have to do an analysis on some particular property to make that determination.
Now, you stated that you looked at the different paths and the different properties on the IEEC East project line, correct?
I looked at the lines, yes.
Okay. And are you familiar with the Tanner farm?
I am.
Okay. And you're aware that on all 3 sides of their house, they are going to have a high voltage transmission line, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And so that is a significant diminution in value, wouldn't you agree?
No, I said I would have to evaluate that and look at the circumstances, particularly in respect to that property, to make that determination.
So having a transmission line 200 feet from your house would have a greater potential diminution than, say, 500 feet from your house, correct?
That is not what this volume of data that I brought you here says. It says just the opposite. It says when it's on a property, it diminishes it to the extent of the easement, and when it's adjacent, it typically does not. Over half the articles say nothing. The data that's actually the case studies that are in here for the residential properties indicates that it doesn't.
And did those case studies take into account noise pollution that comes from the high voltage transmission lines?
It takes into account the fact that the transmission lines are in place and have been actually in place before the residential structures were built. They built the residential structures adjoining these high voltage transmission lines, and the sales activity has occurred over a period of time. So had there been a problem, you typically would have seen some systematic change in values, meaning diminishment of values, and that hadn't occurred in these circumstances.
But in that circumstance, someone was buying the property already knowing that there was a high voltage transmission line, correct?
Right, which is the test of highest and best use, is willing buyer, willing seller. It has to transact in the marketplace within, exposed into the marketplace. So when you're looking at market value of a property, unfortunately, we're not looking at the market value to the owner today. We're looking at what's the market value of the property offered for sale in the marketplace, a buyer coming in to look at the property and buy it.
Would you agree that a property that is subject to an agricultural land preservation easement, which specifically excludes the commercial transmission of electricity and easements, is a selling point for a property?
Objection to the characterization of what the land preservation easements say. If Mr. Stevens wants to show him that language, that's fine, but I don't think it's appropriate to characterize that law.
I agree. Either provide the language from Mr. Stevens or rephrase your question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you think that a property having an agricultural land preservation easement is a selling point?
No. I think it is a hindrance on a property because the benefit of that easement's already been recognized by the owner of that property, the fee owner of that property. So if he goes to sell it to a third party, it's going to have limitations on use that go into perpetuity, as I understand it.
And those limitations are not only on the property owner, but potentially prevent commercial activity on that, correct?
Well, it allows for incidental uses such as power lines, like what would be going across the property is my understanding, but it does not allow for commercial uses. It does have opportunity to go in, and depending on the size of the property, have different residential lots broken out. I think if you have 20 acres, you can have one lot, and I'm not sure what the next guide is, but you can go up and break out residential properties, and with permission of the foundation or the state, you can put a residential property on there. Not to be subdivided, but more to be in conjunction with the use of agricultural.
Is that the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation easement that you're discussing, or just easements in general?
That easement.
So you've read the Tanner easement?
I've looked at it. Admittedly, I'm not a lawyer, but I have glanced at it. Yes, sir.
And And is the Tanner easement similar to the Harford County government easements?
I don't know that I'm smart enough to know the distinction between the two of them. I know the overall intent is to preserve the land for agricultural purposes.
Do you believe that high voltage transmission lines are a commercial use?
I don't.
And what do you base that opinion on?
Well, they're infrastructure use like any other lines that we see that go service, such as water lines, sewer lines, drainage facilities, power lines, telephone lines. Those are all infrastructure that I believe are for the public good.
And is that specifically mentioned in the easement to your memory?
Yes.
I have no further questions at this time.
Does the Office of the People's Counsel have any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Does Staff Counsel have questions?
Staff has no questions. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Any redirect, Mr. Coran?
None, Your Honor. Thank you.
Do the Commissioners have any questions of this witness? Commissioner Herman.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dominy.
Good afternoon.
In the studies that you were discussing with Ms. McElmore, did any of those studies include the type of agricultural land that I would call historical? You know, where there was, as opposed to like a large wheat field, but something that might have historic buildings on it and be part of a historic community. Do you know?
Well, that's a tough question. I don't know that I have that granular detail. What I do have is like the farms essentially And one study ranged from about 50 to 89 acres, so they weren't large 2,000-acre wheat fields someplace. And the other study, I think they ranged from about 40 to 220 acres, with an average of around 80 acres. So I think from a size standpoint, it's pretty consistent with what we've seen with these property owners.
Right. And just for the record, I based on your testimony, I don't believe that you or anyone from your team went out and reviewed the properties, did they?
No, ma'am, we did not.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, I was interested in your discussion with Mr. Stevens. Do you know how much a preservation easement made, how much of a diminution of a property value, a farm value, may be caused by a conservation easement?
Well, I don't, but there are a couple of factors that are in play. One is if there were some opportunity in the marketplace to go develop that property, say this area ultimately is not going to be for one residence and a farm, it might be you could have 20 properties or 20 residences on there, and you lose that ability. If that were the highest and best use, then that could be significant. The other is simply if you were to buy the property, you wouldn't have the right to go sell that easement. So you would lose to the extent of the easement's already gone on the property.
Yeah. So, but we can say there's been some diminution, whatever that value is of a property that goes into preservation, right? Because of
Yes, sir.
the ongoing nature of that, to the heirs or assigns of somebody who comes into that property later. And then you say, I think on page 7, you're saying that your literature review showed another diminution of 0 to 6%, in some instances maybe as high as 9 to 10% in 2 studies. So that's a diminution of property value caused by the introduction of a utility easement, right?
Yeah, so like half of the articles indicated that there was essentially 0. There were 2 out of the, I guess, 16 articles that indicated that there was 9 or 10. And the ones that said 0 to 6, that typically were when it was located within, across the property. So you'd have to account for how much acreage was taken out and what the property owner was paid for that acreage. So part of the 0 to 6 is accompanying that. But then there were some of the studies that show there was actually a price increase within that area. And consistently, some of our case studies say the same thing. And it's people, particularly in residential properties, that look at that as a green space or a buffer space where they don't have a 2-story house looking into their backyard.
Yeah.
That's what we found.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I understood what's happening to the value of these properties in that regard. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Do any of the parties have any questions based on Commissioner O'Donnell or Herman's questions? Seeing none, the witness is dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Coran, you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The Transource will call Mr. Barry Baker to the stand. May you please state your full name for the record?
Full name is Barry A. Baker.
And who's your employer and what is your business address?
I'm employed by AECom. Our business address is 625 West Ridge Pike, Conshohocken, Pennsylvania.
And what is your title?
I'm an associate vice president there, responsible for the impact assessment and permitting department.
On whose behalf are you testifying today?
Transource, Maryland.
Thank you. Do you have before you a document entitled The Direct Testimony of Barry Baker, which was filed on December 27, 2017, consisting of 31 pages and no exhibits?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I'd like Mr. Baker's direct testimony to be marked as Applicant's Exhibit 21.
So marked.
And do you also have before you a document entitled the Supplemental Direct Testimony of Barry Baker filed on June 29, 2018, consisting of 9 pages and 11 exhibits? I believe it should be the next tab in that binder you have in front of you.
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I would like Mr. Baker's supplemental direct testimony to be marked as Applicant's Exhibit 22.
So marked.
And, Your Honor, in addition, one of the exhibits to Mr. Baker's supplemental direct testimony, Exhibit BAB-7, is confidential. Therefore, we would like Exhibit BAB-7 to be marked as Applicant's Exhibit 22-C.
That exhibit is so marked as confidential.
Your Honor, for the record, I'd like to object to the admission of confidential information based on the reasons stated in my previous objections.
Okay. Your objection consistent with your prior objection of yesterday is noted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And Mr. Baker, do you also have before you a document entitled The Rebuttal Testimony of Barry Baker, dated May 8th, 2019, consisting of 31 pages and 3 exhibits?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I would like Mr. Baker's rebuttal testimony to be marked as Applicant's Exhibit 23.
So marked.
Mr. Baker, were these testimonies prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes, they were.
And do you have any additions, corrections, or deletions to your testimonies?
No, I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today that are contained in your testimonies, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
And are your testimonies true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, at this time, we will respectfully move for the admission of Applicants' Exhibits 21, 22, 22C, and 23 into the record.
Applicants' Exhibits 21, 22, 22C, and 23 are moved into evidence.
Thank you.
And for the record, Your Honor, objection based on 22C.
Yes.
Your objection is preserved for the record.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And, Your Honor, we do have some limited live rejoinder with Mr. Baker, if we may.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, may you please turn to PPRP witness Cable's surrebuttal testimony? In particular, page 4 of her testimony.
You said her surrebuttal testimony, sorry?
Yes.
Bear with me a second here, there's a lot of documents.
Your Honor, maybe we approach, I think we have another copy.
Yeah, sure.
It's easier to access.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, I am now there.
Okay, can you just read to yourself lines 13 through 16 on page 4?
Okay.
All right. When Transource was citing the IEC project, was Transource aware of Maryland and Harford County's farm preservation easement programs?
Yes, we were. In fact, as part of our siting process, we met with the MALF folks on a couple of different occasions. The primary reason was to try and get more informed in terms of what the actual, what is entailed as part of that easement program. And also get a better understanding of were there constraints which were related to that program and what they would be interested in us in trying to do if we ended up having to cross over those properties. The meetings were very informative when we met with them. As I said, it was a couple of occasions. On one of the occasions, we were able to show and share with them segments that we had looked at which would potentially cross some of those easements. Feedback was generally along the lines of that they would look for us to minimize potential impacts to the farming activities if we were to cross those properties. And in fact, as part of that siting process, that is indeed what we've endeavored to do. We've done this in numerous ways, as part of public outreach meetings, for example, when we actually worked directly with the landowners. We sought to get their input if there were areas that they would prefer to cross on their farm properties. Were there things that we could do, for example, to move pole locations to the edge of farm areas? Could we cross where existing farm access roads were? Or could we move to the edge of property boundaries? And of course, the largest differential change we made was to move from the lattice structures to single monopole structures to further minimize those impacts. And in doing so, that's what we've tried to do, is understand what the kind of expectations from the mouth board was in trying to minimize those impacts.
Thank you. And our court reporter is very skilled, but if you can just slow down a
I
little
apologize.
bit. All right. And based on that siting process, is it your opinion that the proposed line can coexist with the MALP program?
Yes, I do believe it can. As I said, when in talking with them, our understanding from both the language as part of the agreements which the MALP program did share with us, they gave as example language which would typically go into those easement agreements. And our understanding is that right-of-way easements are permittable uses. And there's further evidence by the fact that there are a lot of existing transmission lines that cross over both agricultural properties, but also over agricultural easements. We do believe they are compatible uses.
Thank you. Can you now turn to page 5 of Ms. Cable's rebuttal testimony?
Okay.
And directed to the portion, I believe it's lines 3 to 7, where Ms. Cable references 2 statutory criteria for acquiring MALP property.
Okay.
First off, does Transource intend to work with landowners, including those who own preserved farmland, to negotiate voluntary easements and avoid the need of going through eminent domain proceedings?
Yes, absolutely. As Mr. Schaefer discussed yesterday, that is always the first preference, is to work directly with those property and landowners. As I mentioned, as part of our outreach, that's what we've always tried to do. We had very, very good and informative discussions with some of those property owners to talk about how we can try and minimize those impacts, and Transource will continue to work with those individual property owners throughout the process.
And if you look specifically at line 5 on page 5 of Ms. Cable's rebuttal testimony, she mentions acquiring MALP property by eminent domain. If Transource obtains an easement for its right-of-way for this project, will Transource, in your opinion, be acquiring an ownership interest in preserved farmland?
No, and I think that's a critical differential and an important point to kind of talk about here, which is that what Transource is looking to do is obtain an overlay easement, which is effectively does not take away the underlying, in no way seeks to obtain ownership of the underlying property, in no way seeks to inhibit the underlying use generally of that property, allowing it to still continue to be farmed and so forth, and allowing for the existing easement to remain in place as it is. The overlay easement is simply allowing for the transmission line to be constructed and maintained and cross over that property, but it would not be related to actually acquiring the property.
And would Transource's overlay easement to have access to the property, would that destroy or cancel out the farm preservation easement?
No, my understanding is it would not cancel out or in any way destroy that farm preservation easement. In fact, again, I reference back to the fact that our understanding is that MALP has in fact purchased many easements over the last however many years with transmission lines already crossing those properties. So to me, that's very clear evidence that they can indeed coexist.
Thank you. And if the MALP statute that Ms. Cable references in her testimony, she particularly references 2 statutory criteria on page 5. If those did apply to Transource if it's granted a CPCN in this case, what is your understanding for how Transource would satisfy those two statutory criteria?
So, in consultation with our legal team, my understanding is, the key criteria is, does the project serve a greater public good? And are there other alternatives that would be better suited? And if a CPCN was granted, our understanding is that we would meet both those criteria, and that, in fact, the determination is that there is a greater public good serviced by the utility line, and in fact that we'd be obligated by order to build the best alternative route as part of that process. Therefore, we would meet the requirements if that was the route which had to go. But again, obviously the preference here is to work through for an overlay easement.
And are you aware of whether the MALP statute that Ms. Cable references in her testimony, if it expressly contemplates transmission lines as a public use to be used in conjunction with preserved farmland?
Yes, my understanding is it is explicitly called out as power lines as a public use, yes.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, with that, we have no further rejoinder, and Mr. Baker is available for cross-examination.
Counsel for PPRP, do you have any questions for the witness?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Chairman Stanek. Good afternoon, Mr. Baker.
Good afternoon.
My name is Ankush Nair. I represent the PRP. Mr. Baker, you hold a bachelor's degree of science in environmental science. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Are there any other degrees or certificates that you have that were not included in your direct testimony?
No.
And you are currently employed by AECOM Corporation, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you're an associate vice president and department manager for the Natural Resources Department at AECOM, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in this capacity, your responsibilities include siting, permitting of new transmission lines?
Yes, that is correct.
And that includes power plants?
Yes, I've cited power plants, transmission lines, yes.
Any other facilities?
They've been the predominant facilities. Natural gas pipelines as well.
And you serve as a technical lead for transmission and distribution and impact assessment and permitting services on the East Coast of the United States for AECOM, is that correct?
Yes, I do serve in those roles, yes.
And Transource retained your company as well as your services to assist in preparing two siting studies, which were conducted and compiled for the development and evaluation of two routes.
Yes, that is correct.
And those two routes would be the IEC East as well as the IEC West.
Yes, that is correct.
And both those routes are components of Project 9A.
Yes, that is correct.
And both these routes were for two greenfield double-circuit 230 kV transmission lines.
Yes, that's correct.
And it's your understanding that this was what was awarded by PJM to Transource?
Yes.
And the scope of the siting studies were tailored to the PJM award, specifically for two greenfield double-circuit 230 kV transmission lines.
Yes.
And there was a fairly extensive process that was undertaken, I believe, in which up to 3 alternatives were evaluated for each portion of 9A.
Yes, we actually started off with a whole series of over 150 individual line segments, which were then narrowed down to represent 3 full alternative routes for each of the projects. That's correct.
And this, and taken into consideration in comparing these routes, were how you describe, I believe, human-built and environmental factors.
Yes, that's correct. When we analyze the routes, we look at 3 overarching process factors. One is to minimize impacts of the natural environment, streams, wetlands, and so forth, maximizing protection to the human environment, which may be residential properties, cultural resources, and also identifying a route which is still, from an engineering perspective, practicable to be built. So there's a kind of 3 larger perspectives that we look at.
And I'm not sure if you mentioned this in the three larger perspectives that you just cited, but it also includes a analysis on impacts to waterways,
Yes,
sorry, impacts to wildlife,
yes, that's correct.
visual impacts,
Yes,
impacts to historical landmarks.
yes,
And the siting studies compiled these findings for the review of Transource.
that's correct. They compiled the studies for the review of Transource and also for the commission as well.
Right, and they were contained in the application that was subsequently presented for this commission's consideration.
Yes, that is correct.
Now, your siting studies were subsequently completed and later submitted as part of the application on December 27, 2017.
Yes,
And this was prior to the introduction of conceptual alternatives 1 through 4, which were proposed to Transource by PPRP.
yes, that is correct.
And this was prior to the introduction of conceptual alternative 3A.
Yes, that's correct.
And each one of the alternatives that I just referred to utilized existing infrastructure and did not represent a greenfield line, at least as far as IEC East was concerned.
I don't know that's completely true. There is components of 3A that does require a greenfield line inside of Pennsylvania.
Okay, but inside of Maryland.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And I'm not sure if you were here earlier this week, but it was noted in the testimony of Brian Weber that Project 3A was viable insofar as it met PJM's reliability standards.
Yes, I believe that is correct, yes.
And it also satisfied PJM's benefits-cost ratio as well.
Yes, that is correct. I don't believe it satisfies it to the same level as the proposed IEC projects, but yes, that is correct.
And so the result of the extensive process that we just discussed a few moments ago, which involved factoring environmental concerns, human-built concerns, impacts to wildlife, impacts to waterways, none of those criteria that were included in the siting analysis compared those factors to any of the conceptual alternatives that I just referred to that were proposed by PPRP.
That is correct. Our siting studies were focused on the awarded project from PJM, which was to satisfy the requirements of Project 9A. That is what we looked at from a siting perspective.
And so as a result, the Commission wouldn't be able to take into consideration some of the comparisons of the proposed route for IEC East with conceptual route 3A if they were to look at your siting studies.
They couldn't compare the environmental components of that. That is my understanding, yes. They could, however, compare the electrical alternative side, which I can't speak to that. I have to defer to others.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Baker, it's my understanding that actually, Chairman, I have at this moment I'd like to introduce two exhibits. I perhaps should have done that at the start, but I was...
You may do so now.
Okay. Should I? Sorry. Chairman, I apologize for the delay. May I have permission to approach, or
Yes, if we have
or I can?
an assistant for Transource could deliver it to the witness.
No.
Thanks very much.
Actually, it would be best to let that copy one. All right, can I continue? All right, now I'm crossing my fingers that everything copied because I was doing it on my own. So,
Quite okay.
Oh, I see, they're stapled together.
yeah. Did you not get a staple?
It's two separate.
Yeah, they're two separate versions.
Gotcha.
Okay, so what you should have in your hand are two sets of data requests. The first one should be labeled as Discovery Request Set Number 12, and these are discovery requests that are submitted by the Power Plant Research Program, PPRP. And they are PPRP 12-05, PPRP 12-06, and they're labeled as PPRP 12-07. Is that what you have before you?
Yes.
Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
And were the responses to the questions prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes, they were.
And at the time that you answered these questions, you were being truthful and honest?
Yes.
Chairman, at this time I move to enter the first of two exhibits as PPRP 4.
So marked, and seeing no objection, we'll move PPRP Exhibit Number 4 into evidence.
The second document is a discovery request submitted from the Power Plant Research Program, discovery request set number 14, and they are answers to questions from PPRP 14-05 through PPRP 14-10, and then they jump to PPRP 14-12 and go to PPRP 14-17. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
And you can take a moment to look it over, but do you recall seeing these documents before?
Yes, I do.
And am I correct in understanding that you answered the questions to these specific requests, or they were prepared under your supervision?
Yes, they were.
And you were being honest and truthful at the time that you answered them?
Yes.
Chairman, at this time I move to enter this as PPRP Exhibit 5.
This document is so marked as PPRP Exhibit Number 5, and seeing no objections, this exhibit is moved into evidence.
Now, Mr. Baker, you are not a farmer, is that correct?
That is correct.
You do not have a degree in farming or agriculture?
No, I do not.
Never worked on a farm?
No, I have not.
You're not testifying today as an expert on farming operations in Maryland?
No, I am not.
You have no first-hand knowledge as to the profit margins or lack thereof of the average farm in Hartford County?
No, I do not.
Of the profit margins or lack thereof of the average farm in Washington County nor the state of Maryland?
No.
And you believe that, and I also will note that you noted on earlier today that you believe that farming and transmission lines can coexist because there are miles of existing rights of way in Maryland, including in areas where agriculture is the prevalent land use. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, as part of many siting studies, I've engaged directly with many landowners, farm owners and so forth, and during that time I've worked directly with them to try and understand what their potential concerns and so forth may be as part of that process.
You have no understanding of how those farmers, however, could potentially be affected by certain factors such as climate change?
I don't know that I fully agree with your comment there. I mean, certainly as pertains to climate change, no, I don't. However, if there are other factors, for example, if they have future expansion options and so forth, we do have some understanding there, again, just based on dealing with those individual property owners. We do recognize that their individual processes and methods and so forth for farming may vary, and that we do try and understand them. So as specifically pertains to climate change, no, I don't. But certainly it's not fair to say there's no understanding of any factors.
Well, I think earlier you testified that you had no first-hand knowledge as to the profit margins or lack thereof of the average farm in the state of Maryland?
That's correct. I have no first-hand knowledge of profit margins, but I believe your question was about how they go about their operations.
Well, let me phrase this question another way. I think you would say that there's about 200 miles of existing rights-of-way in Maryland where agriculture is the prevalent land use.
That is correct, yes.
Now, you didn't go to all of those 200 miles to speak with every individual farmer.
No, we did not. Again, it was done from a review to note how many transmission lines already traverse over preserved farmland.
So you have no idea how many of those farmers may be suffering from factors such as rural poverty?
No, I don't.
Don't know how many of those farmers may be on government assistance?
No, I don't.
You don't know how their yields may be affected by droughts?
No, I don't.
Don't know how their yields might be affected by tariffs?
No, I don't.
You're not aware of how newly elected transmission lines may personally affect those farmers that rely on tourism. And this includes farms that invite individuals to pick fruit from their orchards.
As part of this project, obviously we did engage directly with a number of property owners who brought that up as a concern. I would know, obviously, the most prevalent one is Mr. Shah's orchard, which has been extensively discussed. As part of that process, in talking with Mr. Shah, we have actually, and we did make a change to move the transmission line to the edge of his property so as not to cross over it. But as I also noted in some of my rebuttal testimony, there are numerous instances of pick your own orchards and other agritourism developments which do actually have transmission lines, not only that run adjacent to those properties, but actually traverse over those properties, which have still been in business for a very, very long time.
Now, I want to turn your attention to the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Fund. Have you ever testified in a proceeding in Maryland regarding Section 2-515 of the Maryland Annotated Code on Agriculture?
No, I have not.
So are you aware, or are you not aware, that a condemning authority must demonstrate that a greater public purpose exists than that served by the mouth easement, and that there are no reasonable alternative sites for the proposed project?
Yes, I am. As I referenced in my rejoinder testimony a short while ago, we are aware of that. And again, I point out the fact that first and foremost, we're not looking to in any way take possession of the land. We are looking to have an overlay easement across the land, but that we also believe that the CPCN would actually grant us those two provisions, i.e. the determination that there is a greater public good, and that our line actually would be the best alternative.
I was listening to your rejoinder testimony, and I believe you did not state on the rejoinder testimony, and I may be mistaken, that there is a requirement that you provide that there's no reasonable alternative sites for the proposed project.
That is my understanding of it, but again, our understanding is if the Commission determined that in fact a CPCN should be granted for the proposed route, that we would indeed meet those requirements.
So your understanding is that if the Commission awards you the CPCN, your understanding is you may not have to go to circuit court or any other court in Maryland to litigate the matter as to whether you would have the right to overcome a mouth easement.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't pretend to be able to give a full legal interpretation, but yes, my understanding from our counsel is that we recognize that we would have to meet those requirements if it indeed got to that point. Again, I would make note that understanding as well is that the public use of public utility and associated easement is actually an acceptable use under those circumstances, but if indeed condemnation had to be sought, that we would meet those underlying requirements.
And to your knowledge, you've never gone over or constructed or sited a transmission line that has gone over a property in Maryland that has a mouth easement?
That is correct.
You don't deny that the IEC East is within the Deer Creek watershed? Is that correct?
That is correct, it is, yes.
And your position is that the project will not impact the Deer Creek Scenic River because structures will be 1 mile north of the river?
Yes, that is correct. Where we have our proposed route, we do cross one tributary which ties into Deer Creek, but for the most part we've been able to avoid. We're high enough up inside of the watershed that we avoid any significant stream crossings.
And do you agree that the right-of-way between pole 78 and 79 would remove 2.6 acres of contiguous forest, which includes forest interior dwelling?
Yes, that is correct. There is one area, as was just referenced, where we would indeed have to cross through a forested area. I guess what I'd like to point out is that as part of overall siting study, we're obligated to look at many different competing factors. As I referenced early on, it's the number of stream crossings, it's the amount of potential wetlands that may have to be cleared, proximity to residential developments, and our job as part of the siting study is to minimize those impacts. Invariably, we cannot avoid every single impact, which is why we spend so much time studying and understanding where those potential impacts are. The proposed route that we have selected for the IEC component of 9A crosses the fewest number of streams, clears the least amount of forested area, impacts no wetlands. When we look at all a combination of those factors, we believe we have selected a route which minimizes those impacts. It does not mean that we won't have or have to clear any forests or have any impacts at all, but we believe it minimizes those impacts. I'd also further note that we crossed, and as part of our coordination, we had very many meetings with the PPRP to talk about and understand from them what we could do to minimize those impacts. And in fact, the desire to try and limit where we had to cross through these forest interior dwelling areas was one of those components. There is only one area on this line where we actually have to do that. I'd note that where we have this crossing, it's actually through the, I guess, the thinnest area, I'll call it right now. It's 700 meters wide, so the actual interior forest area of that segment where we cross is actually fairly limited in comparison to the two areas either side of that.
And are you aware of whether there are any forest interior dwelling species between pole 78 and pole 79?
No, I'm not aware if there are any in there, but again, I would make note that this was one area where we could not avoid cutting through here, and we've selected to go through the narrowest area where we possibly can, which has the de minimis amount of potential FID habitat.
And so you didn't conduct any study or analysis to indicate whether, or to find out if there was any interior dwelling species between those two poles?
So as part of the requirements, the permanent requirements which are within the state of Maryland, we are actually obligated to do coordination with DNR to look at potential impacts of threatened and endangered species and so forth. We are also obligated to do forest stand delineation so we understand what those impacts may be. We have received clearances as relates to T&E species for the area, in fact for the whole of the IEC East project we're talking about, as referenced to T&E species. We have completed forest stand delineations and recognize that Maryland has very strict guidelines and rules as relates to mitigation for forest impacts, and we will implement all of those as part of the process.
Okay, but specific to finding or noting if there were interior dwelling species between pole 78 and pole 79, you don't have any data to indicate that there are not those species that exist in that area?
Not at this time, nor have we been requested to so by the state.
Are you familiar with DNR's Wildlife and Heritage Service?
Yes, I am.
They identified that one of the right-of-ways was traversed territory that's suitable for the bog turtle.
Yes, that's correct.
And the bog turtle is a threatened species under the Federal Endangered Species Act and by the Wildlife. Well, I'll just stop there. You understand that it's a threatened species under the Federal Endangered Species Act?
Yes, I do, yes.
And it's also threatened under the Wildlife and Heritage Service of Maryland?
Yes, that's correct.
And the IEC East project has the potential to traverse at least some portions of bog territory, is that correct?
The IEC project will cross over potential habitat areas. We have already been out. We've completed the requested Phase 1 surveys, and again have received clearances which are required. We do not directly impact any wetlands as part of the IEC project. There is one area where we do traverse within 300 feet of potential bog turtle habitat, and Fish and Wildlife Service has very clear guidelines on what has to be done to try and minimize those impacts, which typically involves maybe time of year restrictions and or use of other best management practices through E&S controls, salt fence and so forth to ensure that no harm comes to bog turtles. And the project is committed to meeting all of those requirements.
And I think that if anyone was to read your testimony, you and PPRP's witness Fred Kelly don't necessarily agree on a whole lot of things. But would you agree that Rainbow prefer shaded stream reaches which provide for cooler water?
You're talking to trout streams?
Rainbow trout, yeah.
Trout typically do prefer, yes, more shaded areas, that's correct.
Your siting study, both for the IEC East and the IEC West, don't make any projections about water temperatures changing in any of the watersheds in Maryland as a result of the construction of the Project 9A, does it?
We don't directly, again, as part of the key criteria, and we call this out in the siting study, we do look at potential riparian impacts, recognizing that that would be an area of concern, and our proposed route, in fact, crosses the least amount of riparian area. Again, in discussion with PPRP, including Mr. Kelly, we understood that that was a critical area of concern. And again, as I said, our proposed route minimizes those potential impacts to riparian areas.
And you would agree that using existing right-of-ways and infrastructure for new transmission versus constructing a greenfield line may entail less disruption to environmental features?
Yes, I would agree in general principles, and in most cases, use of existing infrastructure would typically result in less potential impacts, assuming that that infrastructure actually meets the underlying requirements of the project.
I have no further questions. And I just want to move the exhibits into evidence.
They were moved in.
That's what I thought. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It appears that Office of the People's Counsel may have stepped out, so we'll move to Staff Counsel.
Staff has no questions for this witness.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens, right in front of me. Thank you.
Do you want to take a break till he comes back, Your Honor, or?
No, let's proceed.
You're familiar, or good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Stevens.
Good
I'm
afternoon.
the attorney for the Tanners and the Scotts.
Good afternoon, sir.
And you're familiar with their farms?
Yes, I am.
And you're familiar with, based on your testimony, the three proposed routes, correct?
Yes, I am.
D, E, and F?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I want to direct you to your testimony on page 9.
Could you tell, is this direct or rebuttal or?
Your direct.
Direct, okay.
Your original direct.
Okay.
And these list the factors that you considered in your citing of the three proposed routes, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And let's just go through the three routes, and you can tell me which one is which. Between routes D, E, and F, which one maximizes the distance from residential dwellings?
I believe D does.
And that would also be 3A would maximize that, correct?
3A is a separate route compared to what we're talking about with D, E, and F.
Okay. And Route D also maximizes the distance from schools, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And Route D also maximizes the distance from community facilities such as the Norrisville Public Library, the Community Center, and the Picnic Pavilion, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And also the athletic fields behind Norrisville Elementary are least impacted by Route D.
I would not say that any of those facilities you name are actually impacted by any of our routes. They're in closer proximity, but none of the routes impact those facilities that you've referenced.
But your stated goal is to maximize the distance, correct?
That is correct. We do try and maximize that distance to the extent practicable. Of course, as residential development happens, we have no control over that, and oftentimes we actually cannot always get as far away as we may like. As I referenced earlier on, as part of the siting studies, we have to balance many of those different concerns and considerations. What has just been referenced are some of the factors, but it fails to make reference to the fact that our lines actually impact the least amount of streams, the least amount of riparian areas, the least amount of forest clearing, the least amount of wetlands and streams. So it's a combination of all of these different factors which have to be carefully balanced in making that determination. Furthermore, as I said, in terms of proximity, we do not actually direct any of those residential properties or the schools or otherwise.
How many of the streams on Route D are trout streams?
I do not know exactly how many off the top of my head, but again, what I would actually note on Route D, those streams which are actually being traversed through those areas, I believe that at least a couple of them are, but they are the main headwater streams which tie into Deer Creek, again, which is obviously more of a consideration if we're going to cross more of those streams and clear out more of the riparian areas along Route D.
Route D is the furthest from Deer Creek, correct?
No, that's not correct.
You're familiar with the scenic byway or the scenic roadway?
Do you have a specific one that you're referencing?
Well, it begins at Route 23 in Northville Elementary School.
I am aware that, yes, there's a scenic byway through that area.
And Route D is the furthest away from that, correct?
Yes, Route D is the furthest from there.
And Route E, which is the one that you are proposing here today, that has the most significant angles, correct?
Yes, it does have more angles. In fact, I put out an interesting fact when you start to see on these, prior to the Clean Water Act, most transmission lines and so forth, linear infrastructure tends to be built very straight. With the introduction of additional environmental rules and considerations, if you look at transmission lines which are cited now, they tend to have more angles. It's actually a result of the amount of work which is done by utility companies to minimize those impacts. As a consequence, to minimize potential impacts to residential properties, to minimize impacts to streams and wetlands and so forth, it is oftentimes necessary to introduce more angles, which again is part of the compromise factor which has to be considered.
Because it is your understanding that MALF easements are not affected by putting in this 130-foot wide easement, isn't it true that you specifically targeted MALF easement farms with Route E?
Absolutely, that is not the case. There was no targeting of anything. As I mentioned, it is completely detailed inside of the siting studies. We are obligated to look at many, many balancing factors. The MALF easements and any concerns which go with that, that's why we reached out to that board very early on in the process to understand what would and would not be compatible. We're obligated to consider many of the different regulations that exist within the state of Maryland when we make those determinations. The reason for selecting Route E is very clearly documented inside, and it has to do with the fact that on balance it is the least impactful of all the reasonable alternatives that we considered.
There are no MALF easements on Route D, correct, that are traversed?
No, I do not believe that is correct. There is at least one MALF easement and one, I believe, easement held by the county as well that would be traversed by Route D.
And did you meet with the county in regards to their easements?
We did hold meetings with the counties as well. We worked directly with both MALF and the county to get an understanding of where their different easements were. We, used data which was available from them to look at where we would cross. So yes, we did work with them.
And how many MALF easements are on Route E?
Route E, I believe there are 4 MALF easements as defined by witness cable. I guess depending on how you look at that, there's 6 parcels that hold MALF easements on Route E. But I guess the way that the state puts those together is to hold them as four individual easements.
And how many county easements?
2, I believe.
That's a total of 8.
That is correct. Total of 8 parcels, and again, depending on how you break that up in terms of the easements and otherwise, it's either 4 MALF easements or 6 individual MALF parcels and 2 county easements.
And proposed Route E and F are, in terms for Maryland's purposes, basically the same route.
That is correct, yes.
And part of the application, you can move the line 500 feet after you're granted the CPCN, correct?
As part of the application, we did request the ability to potentially shift the line slightly. We call that as part of what we call a micrositing process. Typically, it affords the ability here, as more kind of boots on the ground studies are done and so forth, more information is available, and also as we're working with property owners, having that ability to make minor shifts and adjustments. Typically, by the time we reach about the 60% design phase of a project, which is about where we're at right now, those shifts really don't often happen. Again, it would have to take something pretty significant for a significant shift to take place. So it's really put in place to afford the opportunity to further work with the individual property owners, and also to allow us to implement an additional fill data which comes to us to make minor shifts.
But ultimately, it's within Transource's discretion about whether they shift the line or not, correct? Based on a request from a farm owner, property owner.
Reasonable requests from individual property owners are actively considered. Naturally, there are things that we also have to look at from the constructability side and so forth. We also have to look at it in terms of how it may impact adjacent property owners. Sometimes requests for shifts on a line are made, which may be more preferential to the individual property owner, but may have a negative effect on adjacent properties. So we have to balance that and look at it carefully. But again, the determination is, and in fact, as part of this project, we have made numerous shifts to try and address concerns and input from property owners.
So you indicated you made a shift as a result of Mr. Shaw's request that you go along his property line?
Yes, moving on Mr. Shah's property, we heard a lot of feedback about the preference here to try and be not directly over the top of the orchard areas through there, with the property line being more favorable. So that's just one example of a number of shifts which have been made based on property owner input.
And as a result thereof, there's now a 90-degree turn on the Tanner farm, correct?
That 90-degree turn would have always had to have been in that general vicinity.
So that wasn't to adjust to go on the property line of Mr. Shaw?
We always had to. We were always, even with the shift, the minor shift adjustment that we had, we would have always had to have had a 90-degree turn in that general vicinity.
And you would agree that there's, as a result of your proposed Route E, there's going to be high voltage transmission lines on 3 sides of my client's house, correct?
Yes, I believe that is correct. Not necessarily in close proximity, but certainly traversing around that property, that is correct.
Within 250 feet of his house on one side, correct?
Yes, I do believe it's approximately, and again, I'd note there are plenty of examples of many of the existing lines where properties are and houses are significantly closer than that.
Okay. And you're familiar with the Scott farm, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware that their son built a house on a portion of that property?
Yes, I am.
And because his parcel is separate, he doesn't get any say in where the siting goes of the power line going behind his house, correct?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And that's within 200 feet of his newly constructed house, correct?
The edge of the right-of-way is approximately 185 feet, and it's about 255 feet to the center line of the transmission line.
And how many MALF easements will be gone over if proposed Route 3A is chosen?
I believe there are, on the Grayston section of 3A, I believe there'll be one mouth easement that would be crossed over. And then for the Cornerstone Otter Creek section, I believe a second one would also be crossed over as part of that.
But there's already an existing easement there, correct?
That is correct, which again, I think it speaks to the fact that the ability for transmission lines to coexist with the mouth easements, I mean, to me it's a clear example of how they can indeed coexist.
Are you aware of differences in mouth easements over time?
Yes, we have been told when we met with the board that the easement language and agreements did change over time, and in fact, that there would be nuances on each of the individual easements. It does appear that some more standardized language has been agreed upon now, but yes, we are aware of that.
And you're not aware of whether or not, if you chose existing Route 3A, whether that Mount Farm that goes through there, whether that was placed in Mount before or after that original brownfield was there?
Just, Your Honor, just objecting to the characterization of 3A as a route.
Your objection is noted. Does the witness understand the question?
Sorry, sir, could you repeat that again, please?
Sure.
I think I did, but...
On alternative Route 3A, you testified that it will go through at least one or two MALF easements, correct?
It's just same objection, Your Honor. There's no alternative Route 3A.
Conceptual Route 3A.
Conceptual alternative 3A.
It is conceptual.
Sure. Anything else?
That's my objection.
Conceptual proposed Route 3A, you testified to goes through two MALP farms,
I believe that's correct, yes.
but you're not aware of whether or not those farms were in preservation before or after that original transmission easement went through there?
No, I am not aware, but again, it doesn't change, as I stated earlier on, the fact that it appears that transmission lines crossing through them are a compatible use.
And you would agree it's not desirable to have 230-foot tall power lines through your farm, correct?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by not desirable?
Well, a landowner doesn't want 230-foot power lines going through their property, correct?
I can't speak to what individual property owners would want on their properties.
You would agree that the Tanners don't want it, correct?
Yes, it is my understanding the Tanners do not want it on their property.
And you would agree that the Scots don't want it?
Yes, I would agree.
And you would agree that the significant number of people on this project line don't want it?
We have certainly had a lot of feedback that people have expressed a lot of concerns about the project. Again, I would note when we're talking about the crossing here, and I did bring it up as part of my testimony, the area of footprint impacting that we're actually talking about going over these preserved properties is approximately 0.03 acres. It is very, very small in terms of the actual total footprint on there. I'd make note as well that the MALF easements, for example, allow for the construction of residential properties, as was referenced earlier on, and the construction of one single residential property would have a greater impact than the combined total of all of our poles on both the east and west projects combined.
Can you cite to the attachment as part of either your direct testimony, your rebuttal, or your sur-rebuttal that references this analysis on the ability to overlay an easement or utility easement over a MALP easement?
I apologize, I can't reference it. I'd have to turn to my legal counsel to know where that exact reference is. But I do understand that it exists within the current statute.
So you didn't do an independent analysis as part of the citing study or part of your testimony where you provided this legal basis or opinion as to the ability to overlay a utility easement on a MALP easement?
Well, as I referenced early on, it's based on our initial discussions with the folks at MALF. Our understanding was that we could indeed cross it. It's also referenced that we were supplied the typical legal language which is included as part of their easement agreements, and it does specifically reference that right-of-way easements with approval are an applicable use. I have been shown these the current statute language from my legal counsel, and I am referring on understanding from legal counsel, so I have reviewed.
Are you aware of whether or not a permitted easement in the Tanner easement references transmission of electricity?
I have looked at the Tanner easement, and I do believe there is language in there which is very similar to the kind of standard agreement now, which does reference the ability to have a right-of-way easement with approval from MALF as part of that.
You would agree that the transmission of electricity is commercial activity, correct?
No, I would not agree. My understanding is the transmission of electricity is for the greater public good.
So Transource is not a for-profit corporation?
I believe Transource is a for-profit corporation, but the transmission of electricity, as I said, is for a greater public good.
Are you stating that Transource Maryland is a public utility?
I'm not making any statement about Transource's corporation. I'm not a lawyer, and I wouldn't know even where to begin on that.
Alternative Route D would cross the least amount of croplands, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And conceptual alternative Route 3A would also cross no additional croplands, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And conceptual alternative Route 3A wouldn't cross any additional streams, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And none of the factors that you would consider would be affected if existing power line easement areas or brownfields were used, such as in conceptual alternative Route 3A, correct?
Sorry, can you clarify the question? I'm not 100% certain what you're asking there.
Because you are building a greenfield project, you have to go through all these considerations in terms of maximizing the distance from schools, minimizing the impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as delineated in your testimony on page 9, lines 1 through 21, right?
That is correct, yes.
But if you use conceptual alternative Route 3A, you really wouldn't have to go through that analysis in Maryland, correct?
I can't speak to whether if the conceptual 3A was to be considered. My understanding is it would probably still have to be reviewed within the context of making sure that it minimizes potential impacts to the environment and so forth.
But it's an existing brownfield, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And so there would be no additional crossings of streams. There would be no additional crossing of cropland. There would be no additional crossing of malp farms. And that, in actuality, would have the least amount of impact than building a greenfield, correct?
Yes, I would agree that typically rebuilding existing infrastructure leads to less potential environmental impacts, yes.
I believe they're in evidence.
I believe so.
I want to direct your attention to, I guess it's PPRP Exhibit 4,
14 would be fine.
Exhibit 5.
Was this the document which was just handed out to me? Are you
Yes,
see a reference in discovery request set 14?
correct.
Okay.
I want to direct your attention to 14-08.
Okay.
And that request specifically asked you to cite any studies or analysis relevant to the preserved land in Harford County, if any document was previously provided, well, without reading it. That question asked what specific information you have that addresses the potential effect of the project on farms conserved through state, county agricultural conservation, correct?
Yes, that is correct, yes.
And your answer you cite to exhibits BAB 8, 9, 10, and 11.
That's correct, yes.
Which one of those exhibits addresses the potential effect of the project on farms conserved through state and county agricultural preservation?
I'd have to go back through. I can't remember exactly the context of every single one off the top of my head.
Would you believe me if I said that I've reviewed those exhibits and I can find no study that addresses this agricultural easement analysis?
Again, I'd have to go back and look at each of these, but could you be more specific when you say which does not address those conservation easements?
Well, we can go through them. Why don't we look at BAB 8?
Is this in my direct or?
I believe it's part of your supplemental.
Okay.
Okay, and going through BAB 8, I know it's 78 pages long. Can you look for me where there is a discussion or an analysis of agricultural land preservation?
So this particular exhibit deals more with historic farms and so forth in the area. It's a historic document, so it doesn't necessarily call out existing conditions under the MALF program.
Okay, and so let's look at Exhibit 9, BAB 9. And that one's a short one, that's 4 pages, correct?
Yes.
And that doesn't deal with malfeasements, correct?
It deals with potential impacts to the underlying land use on some of these properties.
Okay. But not malfeasements.
It does not necessarily deal directly in terms of, I'll call it identifying MALF specifically, but it does deal with potential land use impacts to those properties which have MALF easements on them.
And Exhibit 10, that's a series of maps, correct? That doesn't have a discussion or an analysis of malfeasements, correct?
Again, it deals with potential land crossing of those properties which do have MALF easements on them.
Okay. But that's not what 1408 asked you, correct?
1408 asked us to understand what sort of evaluation was done as relates to the underlying land use as part of the siting process.
And BAB 11 is just a map as well, correct? You would agree, based on your discussions,
I just said map 11 also shows potential tree clearing areas, which again are a consideration as part of the underlying land use process.
you would agree that based on your understanding of your discussions with the MALP board, that, excuse me, strike that. You would agree, based on your discussions with the MALP board, that only a court, not an administrative body, can determine whether or not the easement can be crossed over, correct?
I apologize, that's a legal determination. I couldn't possibly speculate on that.
And that wasn't discussed by the MALP board with you?
Again, that's a legal determination outside my purview.
You never heard the words doctrine of exhaustion?
No, I have not.
Court's indulgence, I believe I'm almost done. You would agree that within the 130-foot wide easement, there are restrictions on farming operations, correct?
Can you be more specific?
Well, you're not allowed to construct a structure, correct?
That is my understanding. That is correct, yes.
And you're limited in the types and ways you can irrigate your property, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And you don't have any idea how any of these farms irrigate their fields, correct?
If there's specifics, again, as part of our public outreach process, we do talk with individual property owners. A part of that outreach was to actually try and understand were there specific farming practices which might be impacted where our line route would cross, and where we had that understanding, we did try to look to make those adjustments where we could.
So, for example, if they used an airplane to go over their farm, they couldn't use that with an overhead power line, correct?
Correct. I would assume there were some restrictions in terms of the flight zones around the transmission line, correct?
And so that not only would affect the easement area, but the entire farm, correct?
I can't speak to what those restrictions are. I'm not certain what they are.
That wasn't part of your siting analysis?
That question would be better relayed to our engineering witness. Herzog is on tomorrow, I believe.
And that's not part of your siting study, is it?
We do, as part of the siting, we do hold coordination, and again, that's a key part of the landowner discussion, is to understand were there specific aspects related to how they're doing their farming activities, and what we could do to minimize those impacts. Certainly in the case of aerial spraying, where the transmission lines exist, there obviously would be a limitation in those areas around the transmission line.
And you haven't spoken with the Tanners or the Scotts, correct?
I have personally not spoken. My understanding is the Transource is not allowed to speak with them at this time.
And I believe I went over this with Mr. Schaefer, but he said you would be the best person to ask. You can't put a brooder shed in the easement area, correct?
I believe that is correct.
Okay. And you can't put a cow pen?
I believe that's correct. Again,
Coop?
some of these structures, depending on their heights and clearances and so forth, they may be allowable under them, but I can't speak to the specifics of that.
And you would agree that as part of normal farming operations, people put up temporary structures, correct?
They may do, that's correct.
Such as greenhouses.
That could be, yeah.
And they'd be prevented from doing that, correct?
Again, as Mr. Schaefer testified yesterday, each one of those things could be looked at on an individual basis, and it may be conceivable if they did not interfere in any way, depending on height basis and so forth, that those things could take place. I'd further notice as well, again, that everywhere possible we've tried to move the structures to the edge of properties and so forth, where there are typically zoning setbacks and so forth, which would not always allow construction right to the edge of the property to further minimize any potential impacts on that side of things.
And it's your testimony that Transource has the ability to move the current line up to 500 feet, correct?
As I referenced earlier on, the request was to have the ability to make shifts through what we call micrositing of the line if necessary. But typically, as I said, by the time we get to 60% design, we're normally fairly defined in terms of where we would be with only minor shifts typically taking place. Again, unless there was significant requests from the property owner, which were conceivable and practicable, they may be considered.
So, for example, if this commission ordered you not to go over mouth easements, you could move the line 500 feet?
Get the ability to avoid mouth easements in this area, again, even a cursory review of the project area would make note that it would not be possible to avoid crossing over any mouth easements. The land use in this area, both to the north of the existing Cornerstone substation and to the east of the substation, is largely encumbered by different sort of conservation easements. It's also true as you move further to the west, but also to the west is where some of the primary kind of forested areas and stream valley areas are as well. So being simply told to move the line 500 feet would not avoid having to cross mouth easements.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Well, why don't we take a brief recess until 2:55? I would remind the witness, please do not discuss your testimony with anybody.
Understood, sir.
We are back on the record continuing the cross-examination of witness Baker, Office of People's Counsel.
No questions, Your Honor. Just filling in for Mr. Alexander, but no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Raker. Mr. Dean, does staff counsel have any questions?
As before, no questions.
Thank you. Mr. Gunderson, do you have any redirect?
Yes, briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Baker, do you remember when Mr. Nair was asking you questions about trout streams?
Yes, I do.
Is Transource willing to mitigate potential impacts to trout by revegetating streams with low-growing vegetation that's compatible with transmission lines?
Yes, Transource is. In fact, that's typically a key part of any of the permit requirements and so forth, that in areas where there may be concerns like that mitigation by revegetation, etc., would normally be part of the process.
And would that revegetation effort help with any potential changes in water temperature?
Yes, it may. Depending on the nature of it, yes, it may.
Thank you. Now I'll direct you to Mr. Stevens' questions to you about tower height and landowner preference. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Stevens was referencing a 230-foot tower height. What is the height of the proposed monopoles that Transource would use for the IEC East project?
I believe the average height is around 130 feet.
All right, thank you. Mr. Stevens also asked you about various farming operation structures. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes, I do.
Are there any farming operation structures in the proposed right-of-way for the IEC East project currently?
No, not as far as I'm aware. Again, they are largely open agricultural farm fields.
All right. And Mr. Stevens also asked you questions about placing structures in the right-of-way in the future. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And during the course of your siting process, did you speak with landowners along the proposed route about future development needs?
Yes, as I mentioned, as part of our public outreach process, we always try and engage directly with those property owners to understand what their future requirements may be. As I also referenced, we move it to the edge of the properties to potentially limit those impacts, and we have adjusted the line routes, taking into consideration some of that feedback.
Thank you very much. Your Honor, no further redirect.
Thank you. Do commissioners have questions? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see you went to university at East Anglia.
That's correct, yes.
A lot of big doings over there yesterday and earlier today. Huh?
Interesting times for sure,
Yeah.
definitely.
Well, I wanted to ask you about how you select where a transmission line goes. So is it reasonable for me to assume that cleared land is preferable to forested land?
It can oftentimes be preferential. One of the key, determining factors, for example, obviously we can't cross over the top of residential structures and other structures and so forth, so that's a limitation. As compared to say forest land, for example, we typically take a very hard look at what the regulations of a given state, county, and other ways may be, because that obviously has a key factor in making that determination to understand would there be mitigation, what would those associated impacts be. In terms of open land, I'll call it for want of a better term right now, obviously that can be preferential. The fact of the matter is that typically, particularly as pertains to farming, for example, because those activities can continue underneath the right-of-way, our impacts are generally related to where those footprints are located. So it affords us the opportunity, under most circumstances, to minimize potential impacts.
And for forested land, it's because of if you have to remove forestation, you're going to have to afforest or reforest areas, and there's costs associated with that, right?
There can be costs associated with it, but again, a lot of it ties into forested lands, and I think for this particular project, a good example of it is that forested land, which is related to the west of where the Cornerstone substation is. It's also a lot of the headwater areas of the Deer Creek stream, and so there's oftentimes a lot of threatened and endangered species, which are associated with those areas. So it's a combination of those factors.
So environmental and economic.
Exactly.
You're going to try to select the most reasonably economical route possible, right?
We're obligated to focus more on the most minimally impactful We do not consider cost as part of the siting studies. We focus on minimizing impact.
Right, so all things being equal on an impact level, then you're going to try to find the most economical route.
We would typically, yes.
Are you blind to it? Are you telling me
Well,
you're blind to that?
We do not consider cost directly. The reality is, for example, a shorter route might end up being less costly, but we are blind in terms of a dollar analysis. We do not do that. We focus purely on what we can do to minimize those impacts of the natural and the human environment, and also minimize potential engineering challenges. Invariably, for example, if there are less turn structures, costs will be lower, but we do not directly look at it in terms of a dollar by dollar.
I imagine there's a direct correlation, probably a proportionality even, between least impacted and lowest cost, right?
It is conceivable, but that's not always the case. As I did mention earlier on, if you look at transmission lines which were constructed prior to environmental regulations, for example, they tended to be very straight, but very impactful. From a cost perspective, they would have typically been a lot less costly to build, but certainly transmission lines that are sited now, just because of the amount of directional changes and so forth that we have to consider as part of that to minimize those impacts, they actually can drive costs up. That's where that balancing act comes in.
If I had two farms next to one another and one was in preservation and one was not in preservation, and all the other impacts would be equal, except that distinction, would that impact your decision on which farm to site the line on?
We would look predominantly at the underlying land use of those individual properties to understand how we might most...
All the same, no difference.
Yeah, all that was the same. I guess conceivably that might make a difference. We certainly make note of where we're crossing preserved. If absolutely everything was 100% consistent, I guess conceivably we could, but again, we always have to look at these on a case-by-case basis.
Sure, and I'm just asking generally just to understand how these thought processes work. So, you seem to have said that citing this line is completely consistent with the preservation programs and they can coexist. Am I getting your testimony correct there?
Yes, my understanding is, and again, this goes back to discussions with both the MALF folks that we dealt with, their feedback to us, which obviously want us to minimize impacts and look at trying to reduce that burden to the extent we possibly can. But a lot of that's based on the fact that preservation easements are in existence throughout the whole of the United States, and obviously within the state of Maryland and so forth on individual county layers, and linear infrastructure projects do traverse over those properties and those eased areas, including transmission lines.
So are the Maryland Secretary of Agriculture, who has submitted direct testimony in this case, and the director of the Maryland Ag Land Preservation Foundation both indicate otherwise, and these are the principals in the Maryland state government who oversee these preservation programs, and yet you seem to testify just the opposite of what they're saying. I'm perplexed by that. They don't have the conflict that you might be perceived to have, but why is that?
Again, I'm basing mine. I can't speak to everything in terms of what drove them to make their determination. What I can speak to is like what we've actually reviewed and what is in existence to this day. And the fact of the matter is that preserved farmlands under the MALF program are, to this day, currently crossed by those by electric transmission lines.
Yeah.
They exist on there.
Yeah, well, it wasn't clear earlier, at least to me, which came first, the preservation or the transmission lines. And so I appreciate that response, but I'm not sure that this is analogous to that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, sir.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I had a question regarding some of your response to the PPRP data request. It's identified as PPRP 5, but we're looking at 14-07. And the language you use here is in attempts to cite the location of the transmission line. your wording you use in your response is that you attempt to minimize the impact to agricultural parcels. And I'm curious as to what Transource defines as the impact or the burden of the transmission line. I mean, I know the customer doesn't want it on the property, and so the customer would consider it to be burdensome regardless of where it's at. So from your perspective, what are you looking at as the impact of the line?
So the most direct impact is obviously the actual footprint of the structure itself, because that would be one area where, obviously in that particular instance, farming would no longer be able to take place in that. So that's the most direct impact that comes out of it. The other thing that we also consider is, as I referenced earlier on, is there going to be maybe future development which is planned on that property, and therefore can we look to site our line in such a way that would not impact that future expansion development? That of course requires us to be able to engage directly with that property owner. We also looked at what the underlying farming types are on those properties. So for example, if we do cross over an orchard area, we may be able to engineer higher towers to allow those orchards to continue to farm. So we look at very closely both the type of farming that happens, if the landowner has future plans and so forth, what they may be and what we could do to adjust them. As I referenced, there's also a direct impact related to the actual footprint. That's the most permanent direct impact, because farming can continue under the rest of the right-of-way. We also coordinate with them, so if there are time of year restrictions, for example, when we may be looking to come in and do construction, what we would have to do with temporary access roads, can we utilize existing access roads that they already have out there, which would further reduce potential impact. So it's a combination of both the direct impact of the structure, but also some of these indirect impacts as well.
So would you, as part of your analysis of trying to identify what the impacts to the parcel would be, are you looking to rank, and I'll use the word rank, but measure the Transource interpretations of what that impact would be versus what the consumer's interpretation would be? I mean, if the customer says, well, I don't want it over there, but you realize that by putting it there, you can raise it higher. Which options, how do you select which option is the better, has a greater impact for the customer?
So to the extent practicable, we would always try and work directly with the customer to realize their benefits. The areas where it tends to be most impracticable, for example, if there were just engineering modifications that would be necessary to the line that we simply couldn't make as part of the engineering design, for example, that would be an area where we'd probably have to say to the customer, we can't make that change. And or as I mentioned earlier on, if there's instances where a change requested by that individual property owner would now have a significant negative impact on adjoining property owners. Right. Under those circumstances, obviously, again, it comes back to that balancing act. We may not be able to make that adjustment on there, but to the extent we can, we'd always try and accommodate the property owner's request.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Herman.
Good afternoon, Mr. Baker.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Baker, I'm having a little bit of trouble envisioning where conceptual alternative 3A goes, and let's just talk about Maryland, because, you know, I'm a Maryland commissioner. So I'm looking at any number of maps. I've got BAB 11, and I've also got figure 6 from the siting study. Can you help me out to sort of understand where conceptual alternative 3A would go?
Absolutely. If I may, we did actually prepare a map, which maybe we could share and submit into evidence, which shows that.
Well, show it to all of us, and then we'll see if anybody has an objection to that.
Okay.
What else they have? Up until now, this is all We're back on the record.
Okay, so, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, again, this is not, I guess the dotted line is the proposed route,
That's correct.
and the solid black line is conceptual alternative 3A. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor, that's correct. So it's comprised of two areas. The solid black line leading from the Cornerstone substation, heading to the west and then traversing to the north. That's the component which has the reconductoring. And then over to the east where the Greyston substation is, that would be the wreck and rebuild portion, heading directly north.
Okay. And on the with respect to conceptual alternative 3A, these are not having to add to the right-of-way. These are using adding a reconductoring or adding an additional conductor on existing transmission lines. Is that right?
That is correct. My understanding is, yes, from Cornerstone, the transmission line there would be reconducted through that area. And then for Greyston, one of the lines would be torn down and replaced, but within the existing right-of-way.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
That's helpful. So, Mr. Baker, did ACOM have any interaction with PJM regarding the constructability analysis that it conducts as part of its engagement for Transource?
No, we are not engaged in that. We are retained directly by Transource once a project's been awarded to assist with the siting of that line. We're made aware of PJM analysis and so forth, but we do not engage directly with PJM.
Okay. So when PJM was conducting its constructability analysis, you didn't have any contact with PJM regarding that?
That's correct.
Okay. And to your knowledge, Transource has not proposed 3A as a alternative.
That's correct to my knowledge.
Okay. So Maryland has Maryland statute requires a number of analyses as part of its CPCN process, and one of them says, tell us about the alternatives to your project, right? And that, would you say, where in your testimony or in the testimony of Transource is that analysis discussing the various alternatives?
So that component of it is not part of the siting study that I was engaged in. That electrical alternatives analysis takes place effectively prior to the termination of when we actually select proposed alternative routes once a project's been defined. And so that would have been covered by the PJM witnesses prior and Witness Alley.
So are you referring to the pursuant to our statute, the applicant has to look at alternatives, routes that they considered, including the estimated capital and operating costs of each alternative and why the route was rejected. Is that the siting study?
Again, the siting study only looks at the proposed routes for the IEC portion of Project 9A. Anything looking at electrical alternatives to that would have been covered through PJM or through analysis done by, and I believe will be testified to by Witness Alley.
So I should maybe talk to Witness Alley about these questions in terms of the alternatives?
For the electrical
Consider-
alternatives, yes,
for the-
that is correct, Your
Well,
Honor.
let's say I was looking at, for the electrical alternatives, then you only looked at the alternatives related to the environmental, and I don't mean only, but, not that that's not very important. Everyone understand that. But that you looked at it from the standpoint of forests and wildlife and streams and so on and so forth.
That's correct. We looked at alternative route options specifically for the IEC portion of Project 9A. That is correct. That's
with respect to those types of items,
exactly.
not the electrical
That's correct. Yes.
part. Okay.
Commissioner Herman, before we move on, Mr. Gunderson, do you wish to mark the map that was distributed as, are you sponsoring this as an exhibit?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. I'm sorry. We should have done that before. We would ask to mark this for identification as applicant's Exhibit 24.
So marked.
And
24.
I mean, I guess we would move the omission of this applicant's Exhibit 24 into the record as well.
Yes. Seeing no objection, applicant exhibit number 24 is moved into evidence.
Let me just check and make sure I don't have any other questions here, Mr. Baker. I think that's all I had. Thank you very much, Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Richard.
Hello. Thank
Good
you for
afternoon,
your
sir.
testimony today.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, just as I was looking at your testimony, and you're talking about the quantitative and qualitative analysis that goes into this decision, and looking at those, the factors, I think you call them, on page 9 of your testimony, do you give any particular weighting? Is there a formula that or a model that the company uses in trying to go through and look at all these items, and is there something that you could show to us and say this is the formula that goes into how we weigh each of these factors?
So we do not specifically weight and rank in that manner. What we do is the analysis is based on looking at the total number of stream crossings for each of those individual areas.
And I'm sorry to interrupt
Yeah.
you. But we talked a lot about those, but if I looked at this list, I mean, you think there's items here like specifically use existing utility rights of way or other infrastructure. So that's there. Avoid really circuitous routes. And I look at the map here, and then this is the least straight of all the different items I'm looking at. And you go each one of them. It talks about preserve lands.
Right.
And so it doesn't seem like that some of the things that were important, at least priorities. Maybe that's the wrong word. Things that were in things that we needed to consider as Maryland regulators didn't seem to have the same weight as items that you're talking about today. Am I off on that, or?
So I believe I understand what you're asking about here. So the set of factors that we identify up front initially, there are a set of guidelines that we try and use. So, for example, when we talk about like the ability to parallel existing infrastructure, that's why that's typically seen in the siting industry as a potential good opportunity, can potentially lead to incremental impacts rather than new direct impacts. But it always has to be carefully balanced. For example, again, just using that one as the example, a lot of residential structures may end up being constructed very close to transmission lines, which then would not afford us the opportunity to parallel that. So these are guidelines that we try and follow, but then to help make that determination, that's where we actually take those individual metrics, where we actually do the counts, where we actually count the number of streams that across, count those things, and that's where we get into that.
It is a qualitative and quantitative analysis, so there must be some weight you give to the more quantitative items. And in this instance, the following existing rights of way. It's something that I'm sure you must have taken into account in some manner. It's something that's in Maryland's. It's something we look for.
Right.
That doesn't seem to have really been given much weight in the final analysis here, or like the circuitous routes, that type of thing. Is that correct? I mean, do state priorities get any kind of special ranking in your qualitative and quantitative analysis?
So yes, absolutely do, sir. So part of when it specifically refers to the option to rebuild existing infrastructure, again, specifically for this project, we were tasked with looking at a greenfield project which would involve a brand new double circuit 230 kV line with a right-of-way, which effectively meant the ability to rebuild that existing infrastructure was removed from us as an option. Had that of for this specific IEC project for 9A. It's obviously I'm not talking to the electrical options of being able to do that. I'm just talking purely to the siting alternatives. So as a starting point, those bigger picture guidelines are included. As I referenced early on, we know, for example, within the state of Maryland, conservation of trees, for example, and riparian buffers and so forth are a very critical consideration. And it's actually a combination as we piece all of those together. So, what drives us towards selecting a final route is that combination of a route which actually minimizes multiple impacts. That's what drives us to make that final decision.
So in your work, you didn't even see using existing right-of-ways as an option? Is that what I just heard you say?
That is correct. For this project, our understanding was for this we had to select a greenfield route because that existing infrastructure would not meet the requirements.
So you approached this as that was a requirement. You had to approach this as a greenfield project.
That is correct, sir, yes.
And then as far as some of the discussion about whether MALP lands were targeted or not, it almost seems when you go to, I guess, your rebuttal, specifically you say on 24, parcels are, we've talked about that easements are not considered a conflict. So does that contradict your factors when you talk about in your factors that preserved lands are something that go into your quantitative and qualitative analysis? It almost seems like you're saying, yes, it is, and then you're on page 24 of your rebuttal saying, no, we actually don't consider it all. In fact, we see them as quite compatible.
Well, so one of the things we try and look at and get an understanding as part of the reason why we reached out directly to MALP was to understand sometimes there are easements, for example, or conserved lands which may specifically exclude the ability for transmission lines to cross. For example, a wetland mitigation site may have very clear restrictions on the ability to cross because of the potential impact. And under those circumstances, that sort of conservation easement will be completely incompatible with transmission lines. When it comes around to agricultural easements, most of the time they have a provision in there which specifically allows for the crossing of utilities, recognizing that they are not incompatible. So whilst we do look at potential impacts of conserved lands and what the language is to get that understanding, a lot of the time they will explicitly allow for the crossing of utility lines, and that's why we do that outreach. So we do want to understand what those concerns and impacts may be, but it is obviously equally as important for us to understand what's the specific language, does it allow for that crossing, and even if it does, what can we then do to minimize those impacts?
Okay, so that's when you get to the minimize. I was going to ask, what you say here you minimize, but it only is after you go through that other analysis of exactly how much the state wants to preserve those lands.
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay, well,
So.
thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, no further questions.
Thank you. Do the parties wish to examine the witness based on the commissioner's questions?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Gunderson.
Thank you. Following up on your discussion with Commissioner Richard, can you explain what paralleling means?
Certainly. So an option to parallel an existing transmission line is one where existing right-of-way already exists, and we would look at an option of siting our line adjacent to that existing right-of-way. That's what we're talking about when we're paralleling. So we would be adjacent to, not crossing over, but directly adjacent to one of those existing rights-of-way.
Okay, thank you. And if you look at applicant's Exhibit 24, the Conceptual Alternative 3A map, on the left-hand side, there's an Otter Creek to Conestone 230 kV line. Do you see that?
Yes, I do so.
Did your siting team look at paralleling that line for the IEC East project?
Yes, we did look at options to be able to parallel that line, and as is probably fairly evident from just even from the map that you have in front of you, that whole area there is heavily wooded, a lot of forest cover through that area. As I mentioned earlier on, it's also one of the headwater areas for the Deer Creek area, and so options to parallel there are obviously heavily constrained related to potentially significant impacts to forest clearing, the total number of streams and riparian areas that would be impacted. In addition, there's residential properties which have been constructed as well since the original line. So we did actively look at paralleling options, constraints, but those other constraints basically stop that happening.
Thank you. And as to the IEC West project, does the IEC West project include paralleling existing lines?
Yes, it does. For the IEC West project, we were afforded opportunities there where we could, because we would not impact any of the forest covers and there was no residential properties built up. We were, in fact, able to parallel there for about 1.2 miles of the IEC West project.
And does the IEC project as a whole include the use of other existing infrastructure?
In reference to Project 9A or
Yeah.
just the IEC?
Thank
Yes,
you.
I do believe Project 9A includes other components outside of just the greenfield component of the IEC project that does indeed use other infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Brief redirect, Chairman
That's
Scanlon.
Mr. Nair.
Mr. Baker, I believe that you discussed the malfeasements just now, and you stated that you spoke with individuals from the Malf Foundation, and is that correct?
Yes, we held 2 meetings with folks from the Malf, yes.
And when did those meetings take place?
I believe they were in January of 2017 and again in July. I'd have to go back. I do reference that somewhere. But I believe it was January of 2017 and then again in March of 2017.
They were during the development of the siting studies.
That is correct, yes.
So at that time, it would have been impossible for you to provide them conceptual alternative 3A
That is correct, yes.
or any of the other potential PPRP alternatives, conceptual alternatives that were provided.
Yes, that is correct.
So at that time, any assurances that MALF or that foundation provided to you regarding compliance with, the agricultural statutes, their information would not have been complete as to what was available in terms of existing infrastructure.
The information that we supplied to them was based on the completeness of the IEC project, which was what we were looking to site, which is a new greenfield route.
Thank you. And it's my understanding, I think, that you stated that you would negotiate with the farmers as well, were you to get a CPCN, so that you would not have to partake in any sort of condemnation proceedings?
Yes, I mean, Witness Schaefer is better placed, I guess, to answer in terms of the negotiation. But yes, my understanding is those negotiations will continue, and the preference obviously is always to negotiate an easement over condemnation with individual property owners.
Okay, but you would do that even after you would get a potential CPCN?
Yes, I believe yes, absolutely. There would be no reason not to continue in good faith negotiations.
And it's your understanding that the CPCN would satisfy the requirements of the agricultural statute? I believe it's 2-515.
Yes, I've been advised by legal counsel who believe that is correct, yes.
So in your negotiations or potential negotiations that Transource or ACOM would have, you would tell farmers that you already have an authority to potentially condemn the property. Is that correct?
I can't, again, that's outside of my purview. I have nothing to do with the real estate negotiations. I can't answer that.
No further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens.
In brief follow-up to Commissioner Rickard, I want to direct your attention to the siting study. Pages 67 and 68 and 69.
Okay.
And this is where you go through the various tabulations that you testified to?
Yes, that is correct.
And you would agree that the longer a line is, the more it costs, correct?
I can't speak to cost. I mean, certainly if a line is a lot longer, it could cost more, but there are many factors which define how much a line could cost. So that would be better directed to Witness Stein.
Okay. So you would agree that the proposed route E happens to be the shortest route, correct?
No, that's not correct. In fact, Route D is a tenth of a mile shorter.
Well, I'm looking at page 67, and it says it's 16.3 miles versus 15.8.
That's the total route, and I'm talking within the state of Maryland. It's the shortest. It's Route D is shortest within Maryland.
But it's the shortest overall is Route E.
Correct. That is correct. Yes.
And Transource is building this in Pennsylvania and Maryland.
That is correct. Yes.
And Route E happens to be the second lowest number of parcels crossed.
Yes, that is correct.
And but then you get into Route E has more residential dwellings within 250 feet, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And more residential dwellings within 500 feet.
Yes, that is correct.
And more businesses within 500 feet.
Yes, that is correct.
And it's by far the most cropland versus pasture land crossed, correct?
It does cross more cropland, and as I referenced earlier on, it also crosses and impacts the least amount of forest clearing, impacts no wetlands, crosses the least amount of streams, and impacts no threatened and endangered species as well.
And it doesn't cross any state or federal land, correct?
That is correct.
No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you. The witness is excused.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Council may call their next witness.
Your Honor, Transource will call Mr. Silva to the stand, and my co-counsel, Mr. Kurt Renner, will handle this witness.
Good afternoon.
What's that? Oh, okay. Let's get that in. Mr. Renner, if you could provide your information to the court reporter.
Yes, I will, Your Honor. Curtis, U-R-T-I-S, Renner, R-E, and then, I'll give you my card.
Baker.
You should just listen to me here. Just want to make sure I have exact information.
Mr. Renner.
Mr. Renner, you may begin your examination if you have any rejoinder.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Silva, would you please state your full name for the record?
James Michael Silva,
And what is your business address?
Intertech Consultants, 494 Salmar Avenue, Campbell, California,
What is-
95008.
What is your position at Intertech Consultants?
I'm the president of the company.
And could you just very briefly give the commission an idea of what kind of work is done at Intertech Consultants?
Intertech does work in three main areas: applied research as it relates to electric and magnetic fields. We develop computer software for calculating EMF. We also develop scientific instrumentation that is sold in 59 countries, and we do engineering consulting work on other projects related to topics such as electromagnetic compatibility.
Are you a professional engineer?
Yes, I'm a licensed professional engineer in electrical engineering.
Do you have before you a document titled the rebuttal testimony of James Michael Silva, dated May 8, 2019, that consists of 19 pages of text and then 2 exhibits?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I request that this be marked as Applicant's Exhibit 25.
So marked.
Mr. Silva, was your rebuttal testimony prepared by you or under your direct supervision?
Yes, it was.
And would that also include the attached exhibits?
Yes.
Do you at this time have any corrections or revisions you need to make to your testimony?
No.
If I were to ask you today the questions that appear in your written testimony, would your answers today be the same as they appear in the written testimony?
Yes, they would.
To the best of your information, knowledge, and belief, are the statements of fact and opinion that appear in your written testimony true and correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, Transource Maryland respectfully moves Applicant's Exhibit 25 into the record.
Seeing no objection, applicant's Exhibit 25 is moved into evidence.
And we do not have any oral rejoinder, and the witness is available for cross-examination.
We have no cross.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
There is a sound emitted from high voltage transmission lines, correct?
Under some conditions, there could be.
Can that noise be drowned out if you were in a more populated area? Or would that noise be drowned out?
It depends upon the background noise and what the noise level was. In the situation of the IEC East project, would the 230 kV volt transmission lines produce a noise? Well, as I state in my testimony, there would be some very low level under certain conditions, such as in the rain. And I describe that this would be comparable to a typical suburb at night, or low levels from, say, a light wind or light rain falling, in which case you probably couldn't hear the line if there was wind or rain.
You would agree that this line is going through agricultural area, correct?
That's my understanding.
So it's not in a populated area, correct?
That's what I understand.
And have you gone out to the properties along this proposed route?
I have not.
So you don't know what kind of level of noise currently exists out there, do you?
Not at these specific properties. I'm generally aware of this part of Maryland, though.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Counsel for People's Counsel.
No questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Dean, any questions from Staff Counsel?
Staff has no questions for this witness. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Renner, any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Any questions from the Commissioners? Commissioner Linton.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. At our public hearing, we had several members of the community, specifically farmers, who had claimed that their farm animals responded differently or responded to either the sounds or in their minds the EMF from the transmission lines that were on their properties currently. Could you comment on that? Is that something that you've found in your experience to be a common occurrence or occurrence at all?
Well, Your Honor, with the understanding I'm not a veterinarian. However, I have actually done studies on farms across the United States. And if I could direct you to my attachment number 2, JMS R2. It's an amendment to it, if you have that one with the pictures, yeah. So if you look at page 3 of that, I include some cattle under those. Those are 2 345,000 volt lines in North Dakota, and then there's one transmission line in Nebraska, and it's quite common to see that. I've also observed turkey farms in Arizona and chicken farms in California, and a number of livestock able to go about their business as one would expect. As I said, I'm not a veterinarian, but I have never observed a problem with farming operations that relate to livestock due to the transmission line.
Okay. All right. My second question has to do with your table JMS2. It's on page 12 of your rebuttal testimony. And I'm really just looking for some clarification here on behalf of the number of students across the country who will be visiting public libraries and ice cream stores over the course of the summer. I noticed that the magnetic fields appear to be much higher there than in some other facilities. So I just wanted to know what is happening at those particular locations.
Near the counter of fast foods, I don't, let's see, like near the counter, like at McDonald's or some fast food restaurant where the kids work, in an ice cream store where the coolers are up front where the products are kept. Mm-hmm. That's the source of the fields. In a fast food restaurant, they have cookers, electric cookers, and things like that are all electric. And so the area at the front of the store where the people are is where you're measuring the higher levels, and that's why I give a range. If you move around the store, you find a range of areas. That particular ice cream store is probably near the cooler, and you see numbers that high sometimes in supermarkets and places like that where there are cold ice cream or frozen foods or things of that nature.
All right, so it's not the Rocky Road then.
It's my wife's favorite ice cream, actually.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Do the parties have any questions based on Commissioner Linton's questioning?
No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you.
No questions.
The witness is excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We have no additional witnesses scheduled for today, so we will adjourn until tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Thank you.